February 17, 1905. Midnight. Above the most powerful house in the world, a 20-year-old woman stood smoking in the bitter cold, watching the capital city that believed it was watching her. The wind off the Potomac carried the bite of winter through the bare branches of the White House grounds, where snow fell in heavy, silent drifts across manicured lawns that would soon bear the footprints of foreign dignitaries and domestic supplicants alike. The gas lamps of Pennsylvania Avenue flickered like dying stars against the Washington darkness, their feeble light struggling to illuminate a city that had no idea it was about to be conquered by the daughter of its most powerful man. Below her, in their gilded chambers and marble halls, ambassadors and senators slept the sleep of the politically secure, dreaming their small dreams of influence and access. The fires in the state dining room had been extinguished hours ago, the velvet curtains drawn against the chill. The servants retreated to their invisible quarters like ghosts in a house built for spectacle. But Alice Roosevelt had climbed onto the White House roof, not in rebellion, but in sovereignty. She wore an evening gown of pale blue silk, a creation of the House of Worth that cost more than most Americans earned in a year, its thin fabric utterly unsuited for the freezing temperature, yet perfectly suited to the point she was making. The hem darkened with snow, the delicate embroidery catching flakes like crushed diamonds. She stood with the stillness of a statue carved from defiance itself. In her gloved hand, she held a cigarette, its ember glowing orange against the darkness, a tiny lighthouse of calculated provocation in the vast ocean of governmental propriety. This was not the tantrum of a spoiled child denied her way. Earlier that evening, her father, President Theodore Roosevelt, had forbidden her from smoking under his roof. It was a command delivered with the blustering authority of a man accustomed to commanding cavalry regiments and negotiating treaties with emperors. He was the Rough Rider, the trust buster, the man who would soon win the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating between Russia and Japan. He was, by any earthly measure, the most powerful man on the planet. But Alice, with the cool, malicious logic that would come to terrorize Washington society, had simply taken him at his word. If she could not smoke under his roof, she would smoke on top of it. It was a gesture of compliance so literally interpreted that it became an act of war against the very concept of containment. She drew on her cigarette, held the smoke in her lungs as if savoring a secret that could topple governments, then exhaled a plume of gray into the winter air. Below her feet lay the machinery of American democracy. Above her, only the stars bore witness to what she was planning, and what Alice Roosevelt was planning was nothing less than the systematic conquest of a nation's attention through the simple refusal to be governed by anyone other than herself. This was the calculated defiance of a young woman who had learned, through years of careful observation and bitter experience, that in a world built by men, attention was the only currency that mattered. And by that metric, the figure shivering on the executive mansion's roof was the wealthiest woman in America. The newspapers called her Princess Alice, and she had accepted the title with the grace of someone who understood that royalty was not granted by bloodline, but performed through sheer force of will. Every journalist who trailed her carriage, every society matron who mimicked the shade of her dresses, every shop window that dared display merchandise in Alice blue, they were all paying tribute to an empire built not on territory or gold, but on the infinitely more valuable resource of public fascination. She carried a pet snake named Emily Spinach in her handbag to diplomatic receptions, watching elderly senators recoil in horror as the serpent's head emerged from between diamond clasps. She placed bets on automobile races with bookmakers who whispered her odds in the shadows of Georgetown taverns. She played poker with congressmen until dawn broke over the Potomac, her pile of chips growing as steadily as her reputation for being utterly ungovernable. When the society pages condemned her behavior, she cut out the articles and pasted them in a scrapbook hidden in her vanity drawer, a catalog of scandals she wore like military decorations, earned in a war only she understood she was fighting. The irony would have been Shakespearean in its cruelty had her father been capable of appreciating such literary parallels. Theodore Roosevelt had built his entire life, his entire political philosophy, on the pillars of discipline, moral crusade, and masculine vigor. He preached the strenuous life with the fervor of a missionary. He believed in order, in duty, in the sanctity of institutions that could be reformed but never overthrown. He was a man who had willed himself from a sickly, asthmatic boy into a titan of physical and political strength, who believed that sheer force of character could conquer any obstacle: nature, corruption, foreign empires, the very forces of entropy itself. But the most mesmerizing force inside his White House was not the president. It was his eldest daughter, a young woman born into tragedy, raised in marble halls, and utterly determined to prove that power could not be inherited, only seized. She was the crack in his armor, the chaos in his order, the living reminder that even the most disciplined could not govern the human heart. Every time she appeared in the newspapers for racing her automobile at reckless speeds or carrying reptiles to state functions, it was a public demonstration of the president's inability to control his own household. He could negotiate peace between empires, he could break the railroad trusts, he could expand American influence across 2 oceans, but he could not make this one young woman behave according to the expectations of her station. When advisors begged him to rein her in, to stop the scandals that threatened to overshadow his presidency, Roosevelt had uttered the line that would become his most famous admission of defeat: "I can either run the country or I can control Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." It was meant as paternal exasperation wrapped in self-deprecating humor, a way to charm the press while deflecting responsibility for his daughter's behavior. But Alice understood the deeper truth embedded in those words. Her father's inability to control her was not rooted in indulgence or affection, but in something far more complex and painful. She terrified him. When he looked at her pale defiance, her sharp, intelligent eyes, the way she held her head high against a world determined to diminish her, he saw not just a daughter, but a ghost. He saw the face of Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, the woman he had loved more than life itself, whose name he had forbidden anyone to speak for 20 years. Standing on that roof, cigarette burning down to her gloved fingers, Alice Roosevelt was the living, breathing embodiment of a tragedy her father had spent 2 decades trying to outrun. She was the reminder of the night when death had visited their house twice, taking both his wife and his mother in the span of hours, leaving him with a newborn child he could not bear to look at because she carried the features of everything he had lost. She had grown up as a ghost in her own family, the specter of a vanished woman whose memory was too sacred to mention and too painful to forget. But Alice had learned to transform that original abandonment into something far more dangerous than grief. She had refined the art of being both irresistible and untouchable, of commanding attention while remaining fundamentally alone. If she could not be loved like a memory, she would be impossible to ignore in the present. She had turned her father's inability to see her without pain into a weapon that could wound anyone who dared to underestimate the power of a woman with nothing left to lose. The cigarette burned down to her fingers, the heat a sudden, sharp reminder of mortality against the numbing cold. She dropped the spent butt onto the wet slate of the roof and crushed it beneath the heel of her satin shoe, watching the sparks die instantly in the snow. For a moment longer, she remained suspended between the dark sky and the sleeping house, a prisoner in a palace, a queen without a kingdom, surveying the city that would spend the next 75 years trying to understand what it had witnessed on this winter night. She knew, with the terrible prescience of the highly intelligent, that this moment of sovereignty was an illusion. The world below, the world of laws and marriages and social expectations, was waiting for her with the patience of a spider in its web. In exactly 1 year, she would marry Nicholas Longworth, a dissolute congressman 15 years her senior, a man her father despised and her stepmother barely tolerated. The wedding would be the most lavish spectacle the White House had ever witnessed, and it would accomplish nothing except to bind her to a man who would betray her with such regularity that infidelity would become simply another feature of their domestic landscape. She would spend the next quarter century trapped in a marriage that was equal parts political alliance and elegant torture, watching her husband drink away their fortune and their dignity, while she took her revenge in the only way available to a woman of her position and era. She would have an affair with a married senator and bear his child in secret, naming the daughter Paulina and carrying the truth of her parentage like a hidden blade for the rest of her life. She would outlive them all, her father, her husband, her lovers, her enemies, and in the end, she would discover that survival was both her greatest triumph and her most profound tragedy. But all of that was still to come. On this February night in 1905, Alice Roosevelt turned her back on the city, on the Washington Monument piercing the sky like a stone needle, on the sleeping ambassadors and dreaming senators. She moved toward the open window that led back into the warmth, back into the trap of expectations and obligations that awaited every woman born into power she had not chosen and could not escape. By the time Washington understood that its most dazzling princess was also its most dangerous spectator, the damage would already be done to a presidency built on moral authority but undermined by domestic chaos, to a dynasty that would fracture along the fault lines Alice herself had created, and to Alice herself, who would spend 96 years proving that she could not be controlled, could not be silenced, and could not be forgotten, even as she lost everything that might have made her happy. To understand how a daughter came to rule the greatest White House of the Gilded Age, how she transformed abandonment into sovereignty and spectacle into a form of revenge, we must leave the snow-covered roof of 1905 and journey backward through time. We must enter a different house, in a different city, on a different February night 21 years earlier, a night when the gas lights burned low, when the air reeked of sickness and grief, and when a newborn child lay in a cradle while, in the rooms around her, the women who should have loved her were already slipping away into the darkness that would define her entire life. February 12, 1884. In a mansion on West 57th Street that reeked of privilege and pipe tobacco, where gaslight flickered against mahogany paneling and the weight of Victorian propriety pressed down like a suffocating shroud, Alice Roosevelt entered the world as her mother departed it. The Roosevelt House stood fortress-like against the February cold, its red brick facade and heavy velvet curtains designed to keep the chaos of New York at bay. But on this particular night, no amount of wealth or respectability could protect its inhabitants from the Gothic horror unfolding within its walls. Upstairs, in a bedroom chosen with the tender optimism of young marriage, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt lay dying. She was 22 years old, luminous even in her suffering, possessed of the kind of ethereal beauty that seemed almost supernatural in its delicacy. Theodore had courted her with manic intensity during his Harvard years, declaring her the center of his universe, the woman who made his political ambitions seem not just possible, but inevitable. But Alice Lee was dying of Bright's disease, a kidney failure so advanced that it had hidden behind the swelling of pregnancy until intervention became impossible. In the room below, Theodore's beloved mother, Martha Mitty Roosevelt, lay stricken with typhoid fever, her once formidable Southern charm reduced to ragged breathing and fevered delirium. The young assemblyman, summoned frantically from Albany, arrived to find himself trapped in a nightmare of biblical proportions. He ran between the two sick rooms like a man possessed, watching helplessly as the two most important women in his life slipped away simultaneously. At 8:35 on the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, Alice Lee gave birth to a daughter. 11 hours later, at 2:00 in the afternoon, she died. At 3:00 the following morning, Theodore's mother followed her into the darkness. 2 deaths. 1 house. One devastated man standing in the wreckage of everything he had believed about his ability to control fate through sheer force of will. Theodore Roosevelt, the future president who would charge up San Juan Hill and carve his face into mountains, could not bear to look at his newborn daughter. She was the living embodiment of everything he had lost, a tiny creature with her mother's delicate features and her mother's forbidden name. In his diary that night, he drew a thick black X across the page and wrote beneath it, "The light has gone out of my life." Below that entry, he made a vow that would haunt them both. He would never speak his dead wife's name again. Not in letters, not in his autobiography, not in conversation. Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt became a specter, a woman so thoroughly erased from the historical record that she existed only in the face of the child who bore her name. The abandonment was total and immediate. Theodore gave the infant to his unmarried sister Anna, known to the family as Bamie, a formidable woman whose capacity for love was boundless, but whose role was always that of substitute. Within weeks, Theodore fled to the Dakota Badlands, seeking in the brutal landscape of the American West some kind of redemption, or at least forgetting. For 3 years, Alice Roosevelt grew up as a ghost in her own family, the half-orphan who belonged to a vanished woman no one dared mention, the living memorial to a tragedy that had broken the most vigorous man in New York. When Theodore returned from the West in 1887, he was transformed. The soft edges of grief had been burned away by wind and sun and physical labor. He was harder now, more disciplined, more ruthlessly ambitious. The man who had believed in love as life's highest achievement had been replaced by someone who believed in action, in reform, in the strenuous life that could be measured in concrete accomplishments rather than emotional vulnerabilities. He remarried with unseemly haste to Edith Caro, a childhood friend who represented everything Alice Lee had not been: stern, practical, safe. Edith was a woman who understood that her role was to manage Theodore's domestic life so he could focus on his political ascent. Alice came home not as a beloved daughter returning to the fold, but as a reminder of a wound that would never heal. Edith tried, in her limited way, to love the child, but there was always a distance, a subtle coldness that Alice would feel for the rest of her life. As Theodore and Edith's own children arrived in rapid succession, Theodore Jr., Kermit, Ethel, Archibald, and Quentin, the house filled with the noise and chaos of a large, boisterous family. But Alice remained slightly apart, the eldest child who was not quite of the same blood, the daughter who carried a different mother's ghost in her features. Yet even as Alice navigated this emotional wasteland, the Roosevelt dynasty was ascending with volcanic intensity. Theodore's ambition, once channeled into romantic obsession, now poured into politics with messianic fervor. Civil Service Commissioner under Benjamin Harrison, rooting out corruption with crusading zeal. Police Commissioner of New York City, prowling the streets at midnight to catch officers sleeping on duty. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, preparing for a war most colleagues considered improbable. Then came the Spanish-American War and the charge up San Juan Hill that transformed Theodore Roosevelt from politician into national hero. The trajectory was inexorable. Governor of New York, Vice President under William McKinley. And then, on September 14, 1901, when an anarchist's bullet cut down McKinley in Buffalo, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history at age 42. The family moved into the White House like a conquering army, transforming the executive mansion from a sleepy Victorian relic into a bustling citadel of American power. Under Theodore Roosevelt, the White House became something unprecedented. Children roller skated through the East Room. A menagerie of pets roamed the halls. Boxing matches were held in the state rooms. Foreign dignitaries found themselves engaged in vigorous debates by a president who seemed to have read every book ever written. The press corps, previously accustomed to covering presidencies as exercises in dignified tedium, suddenly found themselves chronicling a family designed for the emerging age of mass media. But in this house overflowing with life, 6 children, countless pets, visiting dignitaries, the constant hum of political machinery, Alice Roosevelt remained slightly apart. She was 17 years old when her father became president, beautiful in a way that recalled her vanished mother, intelligent in a way that threatened to overshadow her father's carefully constructed image. She had spent 17 years watching her father refuse to acknowledge the woman she had been named for, 17 years feeling the subtle coldness of a stepmother who loved her but could never forget whose daughter she was. The other Roosevelt children belonged entirely to the present. They were noisy, secure, the unquestioned heirs of a rising political dynasty. Alice, by contrast, was tethered to the past, the breathing memorial to a grief that had been sealed away but never healed. She was the half-orphan in a house full of legitimate children, the specter at the family feast. By 1901, 17-year-old Alice had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. If she could not be loved like a memory, she would be impossible to ignore in the present. She had watched her father transform grief into ambition, had seen him build an empire on the ruins of his first marriage, and she had decided, with the cold calculation of someone who had nothing left to lose, that she would take those same tools and turn them against a world that had made her into an orphan while both her parents still lived. The stage was set. The audience was waiting, and Alice Roosevelt, the daughter he could not name, was about to give the performance of a lifetime. Within months of becoming first daughter, Alice Roosevelt had achieved something no woman in American history had accomplished. She had made herself famous not for what she did, but for who she refused to be. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Washington society, accustomed to the sedate presence of first ladies who spoke in careful platitudes and presidential children who remained decorously invisible, suddenly found itself confronted with a phenomenon that defied every established category. At 17, Alice possessed beauty that seemed almost weaponized, pale skin that caught the harsh light of the new flash powder like porcelain, dark hair piled high in the Gibson Girl style, and eyes the color of winter ice that held a mixture of amusement and challenge that made even the most. Jaded political observers leaned forward in anticipation. But it was not her beauty that transformed her into a national obsession. It was her absolute refusal to behave according to the script that had been written for women of her station since the founding of the Republic. America in 1902 had entered its own adolescence, industrial, restless, intoxicated by speed and spectacle. The railroads stitched the continent together like surgical thread. Skyscrapers began to puncture city skylines with Gothic ambition, and newspapers screamed in enormous type across breakfast tables in a nation convinced it had a destiny to rule the world. Into this feverish atmosphere stepped a young woman who understood, almost instinctively, that the new century demanded a new kind of female power. One that would not wait in the shadows of drawing rooms, but would stride into the center of the room and make the room orbit around her. Within weeks of her father's inauguration, Alice blue became the most coveted color in the nation. It was a particular shade of grayish blue, the precise hue of a Worth gown she had worn to a state dinner, and suddenly every department store, from New York to San Francisco, was selling Alice blue ribbons, Alice blue parasols, Alice blue calling cards. The color was both delicate and cold, pretty and faintly unapproachable, like the girl herself. Mothers named their newborn daughters after her, as if bestowing a passport to modernity along with the name. Sheet music was published with her face on the cover. Songs celebrating Princess Alice curling on pianos in middle-class parlors, where women who would never attend a White House dinner nonetheless tried to imitate its most dazzling inhabitant. She had become America's first modern celebrity, part aristocrat, part performance artist, part weapon of mass distraction. Photographers trailed her like hunting dogs, their cameras clicking whenever she appeared on Pennsylvania Avenue. If she visited a milliner's shop, Its proprietors displayed placards the next day announcing that Miss Roosevelt had graced the premises. If she favored a particular calf or exchanged pleasantries with a certain young officer, the entire city recalibrated its sense of what and who was suddenly fashionable. The press did not merely cover her, it consumed her, and she fed their hunger with the calculated precision of someone who understood that fame was a form of capital. But this was not youthful rebellion. This was warfare. Alice had realized what her father, for all his political genius, never could. In a world where women were expected to be silent and ornamental, visibility was the only path to power. If she could not vote, could not hold office, could not command armies or negotiate treaties, she would command the one resource that could bring the world to a standstill: attention. She deployed herself the way her father deployed gunboats and reform legislation as a strategic asset designed to shift the balance of power. Her choice of weapons was characteristic in its audacity. She carried a pet garter snake named Emily Spinach, so called, she explained with malicious amusement, because it was as green as spinach and as thin as my Aunt Emily, in a Cartier handbag to diplomatic receptions. The snake lived in a small terrarium in her bedroom, but Alice transported it in her purse like a living grenade. At one particularly stuffy gathering with the Austrian minister, she had been discussing trade policy when she casually opened her handbag to retrieve a handkerchief. Emily Spinach's head emerged from between the diamond clasp, tongue flickering, and the minister stumbled backward with a cry that echoed through the state dining room. Alice had simply smiled, stroked the serpent's head with one gloved finger, and continued her analysis of tariff structures as if nothing unusual had occurred. The incident made headlines across the country. Editorial cartoonists depicted her as a modern Medusa, her hair transformed into serpents, her gaze turning pompous politicians to stone. Ministers preached sermons about the moral decay of the younger generation. Society matrons clutched their pearls and declared that Theodore Roosevelt had clearly lost control of his household. And Alice, reading the coverage in her bedroom while Emily Spinach coiled contentedly in her terrarium, understood that she had discovered something far more valuable than approval. She had discovered the intoxicating power of notoriety. She began placing bets on horse races with bookmakers who whispered odds in the shadows of Georgetown taverns, her small gloved hands exchanging money with the casual ease of a seasoned gambler. She developed a passion for automobiles, those terrifying mechanical beasts that most proper young women viewed with suspicion, and was frequently seen racing through the streets of Washington at speeds that alarmed her Secret Service detail and thrilled the tabloid press. The wind obliterated the careful architecture of her hair, the dust on her cheeks an affront to every rule governing ladylike conduct. But these outings were not private transgressions. They were acts of public theater, calculated performances designed to prove that the rules applied to everyone. Except her. But perhaps her most scandalous habit was the one that took place behind closed doors. Several nights a week, Alice would slip out of the White House and make her way to private clubs where congressmen and senators gathered to drink whiskey and conduct the real business of government. In rooms blue with cigar smoke, she played poker until dawn broke over the Potomac, her pile of chips growing steadily as powerful men found themselves outmaneuvered by a 20-year-old woman who seemed to read their tells with the precision of a professional card sharp. She sat surrounded by the haze of tobacco and the clink of whiskey glasses, listening to conversations about legislation and appointments and political strategy, absorbing information that she would later deploy with surgical precision in her own social warfare. The press adored her. The more outraged matriarchs muttered into their lace handkerchiefs, the more headlines she generated. Editorial pages might cluck disapprovingly about her unladylike conduct, but circulation numbers spiked whenever her name appeared. She had become a national spectacle, and like all spectacles, she served to distract. This is what Theodore's advisors understood, and what terrified them. Every column inch devoted to Princess Alice smoking or racing or brandishing her snake was a column inch not devoted to antitrust legislation, labor disputes, or foreign policy. When his cabinet members approached him in tones of suppressed panic, begging him to rein her in for the sake of his administration, Theodore Roosevelt delivered the line that would pass into American folklore: "I can either run the country or I can control Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." It was delivered with that combination of mock chivalry and genuine exhaustion that charmed journalists and masked deeper fractures. To the public, it was a delicious joke. The vigorous president outmaneuvered not by trusts or European monarchs, but by a willful daughter in couture gowns. But that quotation, meant as paternal exasperation, became Alice's declaration of independence. In those words, her father had admitted not only defeat, but impotence. He had proclaimed before the nation that she was ungovernable, that no man, not even the President of the United States, could compel her obedience. It was a coronation disguised as a complaint. She had learned that bad behavior was the only thing that guaranteed her presence could not be ignored, could not be dismissed, could not be relegated to the ornamental role that society had designed for women of her class. But what happens when a person builds their entire identity on the need to be seen? Behind the laughter and the headlines, behind the shimmering gowns and the reckless wagers, Alice was constructing something far more dangerous than a reputation. She was building a fortress of wit and spectacle around the wounded child inside, the one her father had abandoned on Valentine's Day, 1884. Every outrageous act was a brick in that wall, every scandal a layer of mortar protecting the vulnerable core that had learned, at 17 days old, that love was conditional and presence could be withdrawn without warning. The very things that made her famous, her sharp tongue, her defiance, her refusal to be sentimental, were the scar tissue of her childhood trauma. She was performing a version of strength that was brittle and defensive, designed to prove to her father that she did not need his approval, even as she desperately sought his attention. She used humor as a shield and cynicism as a sword, keeping the world at a distance even as she invited it to watch her burn. The crack in the armor appeared not in Alice herself, but in the institution that contained her. The White House, that marble symbol of American power and dignity, was being slowly undermined by the presence of a young woman who refused to play by its rules. Foreign dignitaries no longer knew whether they were being entertained or mocked. Society matrons stopped accepting invitations to state dinners, afraid of what Alice might do or say. Theodore's political enemies began using his daughter as evidence of his inability to govern, suggesting that a man who could not control his own household had no business running a nation. As 1905 approached, the tension in the executive mansion became palpable. Alice's escapades were no longer merely embarrassing. They were becoming a political liability that threatened to overshadow Theodore's carefully constructed image as a moral reformer. The conservative elements of the Republican Party looked at the president's daughter and saw a lack of discipline that bordered on anarchy. The whispers grew louder, the editorials more critical. Something had to be done. The problem of Alice had to be solved. Soon, the White House would attempt a solution that was both brilliant and catastrophic. They would send her as far away as they could. A massive diplomatic mission was being planned for the Pacific, a congressional goodwill tour that would take her to the courts of emperors and the palaces of shoguns. It was presented as an honor, an opportunity for the president's daughter to represent American interests abroad. But Alice understood the truth immediately. This was exile disguised as adventure. What Theodore Roosevelt did not understand was that by sending Alice away, he was not solving his problem, but amplifying it exponentially. He was taking a rebellious daughter who had learned to weaponize scandal in the confined space of Washington society, and he was giving her an entire hemisphere as her stage. He was transforming a troublesome first daughter into something far more powerful, a diplomatic weapon that no one, least of all Alice herself, knew how to control. The girl who had conquered Washington with a pet snake and a pack of cigarettes was about to discover that her appetite for attention was not a character flaw but a superpower, and that the world beyond America's borders was hungry for exactly the kind of spectacle she had spent her entire life perfecting. July 8, 1905. As the steamship Manchuria departed San Francisco Bay, cutting through Pacific waves that stretched like hammered pewter toward the horizon, Alice Roosevelt stood at the rail in white silk, staring ahead with the expression of a general surveying a battlefield she intended to win. The wind off the ocean clawed at her gown, snapping its hem against her legs like a banner in a hard sea breeze. Behind her, the American continent receded into a gray smudge, taking with it the suffocating scrutiny of Washington society, the endless photographers, and the rules that had governed every moment of her 21 years. Ahead lay the vast, mysterious expanse of Asia, empires of jade and gold, courts of ancient ritual, and opportunities for power that a young woman in America could scarcely imagine. The ship carried an official congressional delegation of 80 members, Secretary of War William Howard Taft, 7 senators, 23 congressmen, their wives and daughters, all dressed in their diplomatic finest, as they embarked on what was being called the most ambitious goodwill tour in American history. The stated purpose was to showcase American presence in the Pacific following the Spanish-American War, to inspect the newly acquired Philippines, strengthen ties with Japan, and assert American influence in a region rapidly shifting under the weight of imperial ambitions. The newspapers called it the Imperial Cruise, and it would last nearly 3 months, covering thousands of miles through territories that represented the future frontiers of American power. But everyone who mattered understood the unstated purpose. This was an exile disguised as diplomacy, a way to remove Alice Roosevelt from Washington, where her antics had begun to threaten not merely her father's dignity, but his entire presidency. Theodore Roosevelt had orchestrated this solution with the same strategic thinking he applied to trust-busting and foreign policy. If Alice could not be controlled, she could at least be contained. If she insisted on being a spectacle, better that spectacle unfold thousands of miles from the capital, where it might actually serve American interests. The president had convinced himself that exposure to the wider world would chasten his daughter, that she would return humbled by the experience of being a minor player on the vast stage of international diplomacy. But Theodore Roosevelt had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had sent his daughter to charm emperors and princes, thinking the experience would diminish her. Instead, he had given her exactly what she had been training for her entire life, an audience worthy of her ambition, and a stage vast enough to contain her appetite for attention. The voyage across the Pacific took 2 weeks, and Alice spent those days transforming herself from troublesome first daughter into something far more dangerous. She moved through the ship's corridors like a reigning empress in temporary exile, studying briefing materials with an intensity that surprised even the seasoned diplomats on board. She memorized the names of Japanese ministers and Korean princes, the intricacies of trade agreements and territorial disputes. She learned to speak in the careful language of diplomacy while maintaining the sharp wit that made her conversation irresistible. The congressman treated her as both a curiosity and a prize, the president's daughter, yes, but also the most bankable source of publicity on board. Their wives alternated between admiration and hostility, caught between the desire to bask in her reflected glamour and the fear that their husbands might find her too fascinating. By the time the Manchuria approached Yokohama Harbor, Alice Roosevelt had weaponized her charm with the precision of a military strategist. The Japanese reception was unlike anything the delegation had anticipated. Emperor Meiji, the architect of Japan's modernization, had agreed to meet with the American visitors, a rare honor that signaled Japan's growing importance on the world stage. But when the delegation was presented at the Imperial Palace, it became immediately clear that the emperor's interest centered not on the aging congressmen or their pompous speeches, but on the young woman in the Worth gown who spoke to him with a combination of deference and barely concealed amusement. Alice discovered she possessed a talent more dangerous than rebellion. She could make powerful men believe she was indispensable. The emperor, accustomed to being approached with trembling formality, found himself engaged in actual conversation with this American girl who asked intelligent questions about Japanese industrialization and listened to his answers with genuine interest. She complimented the gardens at the imperial palace with specific references to particular species of cherry trees. She discussed the Russo-Japanese War, which her father had recently mediated, with a nuanced understanding of Japanese strategic objectives that surprised the emperor's own ministers. Crowds lined the streets of Tokyo 10 deep just to catch a glimpse of her carriage. They waved American flags and shouted banzai. As she passed, a living symbol of the new alliance between the rising power of the East and the colossus of the West. Alice absorbed this adulation not with vanity, but with calculation. She realized that her celebrity, which in Washington was treated as a frivolous distraction, was here a potent instrument of soft power. She could open doors that remained closed to Taft and the senators. She could extract promises, smooth over insults, and gather intelligence simply by being the charming, beautiful, unthreatening Princess Alice. Within days, Alice Roosevelt had become the unofficial ambassador of the American delegation. She dined with ministers and extracted promises about trade agreements that the official diplomats had been negotiating unsuccessfully for months. Later, in her cabin, she wrote letters by candlelight, sharp, detailed, merciless little reports that made their way back to Washington in diplomatic pouches, addressed to friends in the administration, who quickly realized that the president's daughter was supplying them with more lucid observations than some of their own appointed envoys. When the delegation moved on to the Philippines, Alice toured battlefields where American soldiers were still fighting insurgents, riding on horseback through jungle trails with a fearless enthusiasm that endeared her to the military command. She whispered strategic advice to generals who, disarmed by her youth and gender, found themselves confiding their frustrations with Washington's bureaucracy and taking counsel from a 21-year-old woman because her insights were sharper than those of men 3 times her age. She walked through hospitals and saw the cost of empire, then attended lavish dinners that tried to pretend that cost did not exist. In the spaces between, she began to understand something that would stay with her for the rest of her life, that empires, like families, are built on carefully managed illusions and quiet, cultivated forgetfulness. But amidst the diplomatic triumphs and the imperial pageantry, Alice was conducting a campaign of a different sort. Among the congressional delegation was Nicholas Longworth, a representative from Ohio who stood out from the gray-suited mass of politicians like a peacock among pigeons. 15 years her senior, balding with a drooping mustache and the perpetually amused expression of a man who found life to be a grand, slightly ridiculous joke, Longworth possessed a reputation for wine, women, and political pragmatism that made him the antithesis of everything Theodore Roosevelt stood for. Longworth was a creature of the old guard, the conservative Republican establishment that viewed Theodore's progressive reforms with deep suspicion. He was wealthy, cynical, and more interested in the maintenance of power than the pursuit of moral crusades. He moved through the world with the languid assurance of a man who belonged to an older Republican order, a clubbable, backroom, cigar and brandy establishment that Theodore Roosevelt privately despised and publicly tolerated. To Theodore, he represented everything corrupt about American politics. To Alice, he was irresistible. The romance began somewhere in the waters between Hawaii and Japan, in the liminal space of ocean travel where normal rules seemed suspended. They began with banter on deck in the evenings, as the sky dissolved into deep indigo and the lights from the ship cast shuddering reflections across the water. Longworth teased her about her notoriety. She mocked him for his carefully cultivated nonchalance. He treated her not as fragile presidential glassware to be handled with reverence, but as an equal combatant in verbal sparring. In salons and drawing rooms, he was accustomed to being the most charming person present. On the Manchuria, he had met his match. For Alice, the affair was intoxicating not because of love, but because of secrecy. She had spent her entire life being watched, photographed, recorded, interpreted, and misinterpreted. Every gesture was fodder for gossip. Every expression could become a headline. With Longworth, she discovered something rare and perilous, the possibility of vanishing. They could step away from the glittering main deck into narrow corridors, half-lit stairwells, quiet stretches of railing at night where the only witness was the endless black water. They met in the ship's smoking room after midnight when the other passengers had retired. They exchanged coded glances during diplomatic receptions in Tokyo and Manila. In those stolen interludes, she was not the president's daughter, not the spectacle, not the endlessly scrutinized Princess Alice. She was simply a woman talking to a man who did not seem particularly awed by her lineage. That, perhaps, was the true seduction. Longworth belonged emphatically to her father's political enemies, the conservative Republicans who would later resist Theodore's reforms and attempt to pull the party back toward the comforts of unbothered industrial wealth. To step toward Nicholas was to step, however unconsciously, toward the camp that would one day try to undo her father's legacy. It was a quiet act of treason wrapped in flirtation. If Theodore Roosevelt represented discipline, crusade, and moral clarity, Longworth represented compromise, indulgence, and the pleasure of never taking anything entirely seriously. Where her father was a citadel, Longworth was a salon. Alice was discovering that she could maintain multiple identities simultaneously, the diplomatic asset charming emperors, the rebellious daughter scandalizing her chaperones, the sophisticated woman conducting a secret romance. Each role fed the others, creating a persona so complex and contradictory that no one could pin down exactly who Alice Roosevelt actually was. This multiplicity was itself a form of power, a way of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. When the Manchuria finally turned homeward in September 1905, Alice Roosevelt was no longer merely the rebel who had terrorized Washington with a pet snake and poker games. She had become something far more complex, an unofficial diplomat whose observations were quietly valued in the highest offices of government, and a woman bound by growing attachment to a man who stood at the nexus of personal desire and political heresy. The return to Washington was a triumph. Crowds thronged the harbor to see her return, bands played, and newspapers hailed her as the Empress of the Pacific, who had charmed Japan, dazzled the Philippines, and enchanted every port in between. When she descended the gangplank, she moved like a conquering queen returning from successful campaign, photographers scrambling to capture her image, while reporters shouted questions about her meetings with emperors and princes. They saw the triumph. They did not see the choice she had already made. Because Alice Roosevelt brought back more than diplomatic success and breathless headlines. She brought back a decision that would bind her to her father's political enemies for the rest of her life. Somewhere between Tokyo and Manila, between the diplomatic receptions and the secret meetings with Longworth, Alice Roosevelt had decided to marry Nicholas Longworth. The decision was not made from love. Alice was far too calculating for that. It was made from a complex mixture of rebellion, pragmatism, and the desire to establish her own household beyond her father's control. Longworth offered escape from the White House, where she would always be the half-orphan, the specter of her father's first marriage. He offered entry into the old Republican establishment that her father was trying to reform, a way to position herself as a power broker in her own right. And perhaps most importantly, he offered her the one thing she had never possessed, the ability to make a choice about her own life that her father could not prevent. She had proven that she could operate independently on the world stage. She had charmed emperors and negotiated with ministers. The girl who had needed to scandalize Washington to prove her existence had discovered she could simply leave Washington behind. In choosing to marry Nicholas Longworth, Alice Roosevelt believed she was trading the sanctuary of her father's house for freedom. She did not yet understand that she was merely exchanging one gilded cage for another, that the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build for ourselves in the intoxicating belief that we are finally, truly free. The exile meant to tame her had instead armed her with the knowledge of her own power. But power, as Alice would soon discover, is not the same thing as happiness, and the most brilliant strategies can lead to the most devastating defeats. February 17th, 1906. In the most lavish White House wedding in history, Alice Roosevelt walked down the aisle on her father's arm, knowing she was about to make the greatest mistake of her life. Winter fog pressed against the windows of the East Room like a living thing, muffling the sounds of the capital city and transforming the morning into something dreamlike and faintly ominous. Inside the executive mansion, the atmosphere crackled with the electric friction of immense wealth grinding against political power. 1,000 guests, the absolute elite of American society and international diplomacy, filled the transformed ballroom, their breath held not in reverence for the sacrament, but in avid anticipation of witnessing what the newspapers had already christened the social event of the decade. The bride wore a gown that cost $10,000, more than most American families would earn in their lifetimes. It was a creation of the House of Worth, constructed from white satin brocade and antique Brussels lace, with a train that stretched 18 feet behind her like a river of cream and moonlight. The diamonds at her throat caught the gaslight and threw it back in cold, precise flashes. Foreign dignitaries had presented gifts of staggering opulence: pearls from the Philippines, jade from China, gold from Japan, diamonds from South Africa, a hoard of tribute that rivaled the treasuries of small nations. Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States and architect of American power, gave away his eldest daughter with tears streaming down his face. The congregation saw paternal emotion, the natural sadness of a father losing his daughter to marriage. They did not see the relief beneath those tears, the unspoken gratitude that this particular problem was finally being solved. Alice was becoming someone else's responsibility, someone else's burden to bear. But Alice was not crying. She was calculating. As she moved toward the altar where Nicholas Longworth waited, balding, mustachioed, radiating the easy charm of a man who had never been denied a pleasure, Alice was performing a complex internal mathematics. She understood exactly what this ceremony represented, not a union of hearts, but a merger conducted in lace and liturgy. She was 22 years old, famous beyond measure, and desperate to escape the house where she had always been a ghost, haunting her father's conscience. Marriage was the only exit door available to a woman of her time and station, and Nicholas Longworth was the key she had chosen. He was wealthy, socially impeccable, and politically powerful. But more than that, he represented something that would have horrified her father had Theodore understood the full implications. By marrying Longworth, Alice was choosing sides in a battle that had not yet fully erupted, but was already simmering beneath the surface of Republican politics. Her new husband embodied the conservative old guard, the men of industry, high tariffs, and comfortable status quo, who viewed Theodore's progressive reforms with deep suspicion and growing hostility. Theodore Roosevelt was the trust buster, the conservationist, the radical who believed government should curb the excesses of capitalism. Nicholas Longworth was the creature of those excesses, a man who believed the business of government was to protect business. In selecting him, Alice was perhaps unconsciously crossing an invisible line from her father's camp to his future enemies. She was not merely marrying for escape or autonomy, she was sleeping with the opposition. The reception transformed the White House into a glittering amphitheater of imperial excess. 8,000 guests streamed through the executive mansion over the course of the day, a number so vast that the staff had abandoned any pretense of intimacy. Champagne flowed in fountains that sparkled like liquid starlight. The wedding cake, a towering confection of sugar and architectural ambition, was cut not with a delicate knife, but with a cavalry sword, Theodore's own blade from his Rough Rider days, now pressed into service as a ceremonial implement. Alice wielded the sword with theatrical violence, bringing it down through the frosting with a force that delighted the press and sent a shiver through the more traditional guests. It was a gesture of dominance disguised as whimsy, a signal that even as a wife, she intended to remain a warrior. But the sword was also prophetic, a weapon drawn at the beginning of a conflict that would consume the next quarter-century of her life. The catastrophe was not immediate. It was a slow, grinding erosion that began almost before the rice had been swept from the White House steps. Within months of their return from a European honeymoon filled with diplomatic receptions and strained intimacy, the fairy tale crumbled with the systematic efficiency of a controlled demolition. Nicholas Longworth resumed his bachelor habits with the casual brutality of a man who had never intended fidelity to be part of the marital contract. He drank with professional dedication, his charm curdling into sloppy sentimentality as the evenings wore on. He gambled with a recklessness that threatened even his substantial inherited fortune. And he returned to his mistresses, actresses, society wives, anyone who caught his wandering attention, conducting these affairs with an arrogant assumption that Alice would tolerate them because that was what sophisticated women did. For Alice, who had spent her entire life demanding to be the center of attention, this indifference was a humiliation sharper than any blade. Her husband did not hate her. Worse, he found her irrelevant. To him, she was a political ornament, beautiful, valuable, useful for opening doors and charming donors, but ultimately decorative. He dismissed her political insights, laughed off her ambitions, and treated her intellect as an amusing parlor trick. The fortress she had built around her heart, the armor of wit and celebrity she had crafted so carefully, proved useless against the weapon of systematic indifference. For 19 years, Alice endured. She transformed their house on Massachusetts Avenue into Washington's most influential salon, where senators and cabinet members gathered to be entertained by her wit and wounded by her tongue. She became famous for her cruelty, for the devastating one-liners that could destroy reputations and the sharp observations that revealed the gap between public virtue and private vice. A pillow on her sofa bore the embroidered motto that became her signature: "If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me." She played the role of the sophisticated political wife to perfection, while her husband systematically destroyed their fortune and their reputation. Longworth's gambling debts mounted like storm clouds. His affairs became increasingly public, conducted with the brazen contempt of a man who believed his wife's celebrity would shield him from consequences. His drinking transformed from social lubrication into genuine alcoholism that left him slumped in his chair at their elegant dinner parties, while Alice maintained the conversation as if nothing were amiss. The marriage had become a prison more confining than her father's house had ever been. At least in the White House, she had been the center of attention, the rebellious daughter whose scandals made headlines. As Mrs. Nicholas Longworth, she was expected to be supportive, decorative, and silent about her husband's humiliations. The very qualities that had made her famous, her defiance, her refusal to conform, her sharp intelligence, now had nowhere to go except inward, where they curdled into bitterness and a rage that could only be expressed through the socially acceptable weapon of wit. And then, in 1925, at the age of 41, Alice Roosevelt committed the ultimate rebellion. After nearly 2 decades of a barren, loveless marriage, she announced she was pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through Washington society. Everyone who mattered knew that Alice and Nicholas lived effectively estranged lives under the same roof. The timing was biologically possible, but socially implausible. When the child was born, a daughter named Paulina, the whispers became a roar of scandal barely contained by the veneer of respectability. Because everyone understood what Alice made no effort to hide from her inner circle, the father was not Nicholas Longworth. The father was Senator William Borah of Idaho. The choice of Borah was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Known as the Lion of Idaho, he was a fierce progressive, an intellectual firebrand, and a political rival of Nicholas Longworth. He was everything her husband was not: intense, principled, passionate, a man of convictions rather than comfortable compromises. He was also married, making their long affair a permanent state of half-commitment that suited Alice's emotional architecture perfectly. She could be intimate without being vulnerable, connected without being trapped. By bearing his child, Alice was planting a flag of conquest in the middle of her husband's home. It was the ultimate act of revenge against a marriage that had become unbearable, a way to assert her bodily autonomy in the most undeniable way possible, while simultaneously humiliating the man who had treated her as decorative furniture for 2 decades. Nicholas Longworth, faced with a scandal that could destroy his speakership and his party's reputation, chose the path of least resistance. He accepted the child. He gave Paulina his name. He played the role of the doting father for the photographers, bouncing the baby on his knee while Alice looked on with a sphinx-like expression that revealed nothing and suggested everything. But the ultimate victim of this revenge was not Nicholas Longworth. It was Paulina herself, a child born to be both a secret and a scandal, raised in a household where her mother's bitterness and her nominal father's indifference created an atmosphere of elegant toxicity. Alice, who had spent her entire life feeling unwanted by her own father, had brought a child into the world as an instrument of marital warfare. The cycle of abandonment that had begun with Theodore's inability to look at his newborn daughter in 1884 was now being perpetuated in a new generation. Nicholas Longworth died in 1931, succumbing to pneumonia at the age of 61, his constitution weakened by decades of systematic self-destruction. Alice was 57 years old, finally free from a union that had lasted 25 years, but had never been a marriage in any meaningful sense. She stood at his funeral with the composed dignity expected of a congressional widow, but those who knew her well saw the relief beneath the black veil. She was finally free to be herself, to live without the pretense of being a supportive political wife, to pursue her own agenda without having to manage her husband's embarrassments. The house on Massachusetts Avenue became entirely hers. She could fill it with whomever she chose, say whatever she wanted, conduct her life according to her own rules. But freedom, she would soon discover, was the cruelest cage of all, because in gaining her independence, she had lost the structure that had given her life meaning, however painful that meaning had been. She had spent 25 years defining herself in opposition to her husband, using his failures as justification for her own cruelty and bitterness. Without him to rebel against, without the marriage to endure, she was left with only herself, and the daughter whose presence was a constant reminder of the revenge that had seemed so satisfying at the time, but now felt hollow and destructive. The gilded cage had not opened on her wedding day, it had simply changed shape. She had traded her father's house for her husband's, and her husband's house for the prison of her own making, a fortress of wit and cruelty that kept the world at bay, but also kept out anything resembling genuine connection or love. She had won every battle and lost the only war that mattered, the war for her own happiness. Alice Roosevelt Longworth would live another 49 years, ruling Washington society with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove, the undisputed queen of a capital that both feared and adored her. But she ruled over a kingdom of ruins, the empress of her own devastation, the architect of a tragedy that had begun with a wedding dress and ended with the recognition that the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build for ourselves in the name of freedom. After Nicholas Longworth's death, Alice Roosevelt did what she had always done. She survived. And in surviving, she became something more dangerous than a scandal or a celebrity. She became an institution. The transformation was gradual, but inexorable, like the slow accumulation of sediment that eventually forms bedrock. Her Georgetown townhouse on Massachusetts Avenue became Washington's most feared destination, a place where power came not to be celebrated, but to be tested, measured, and often found wanting. The drawing room where she held court was deliberately shabby, worn furniture, faded upholstery, tea that was perpetually tepid. No one came for the comfort or the cuisine. They came for Alice, for the privilege and the peril of sitting within range of the sharpest tongue in the capital. Politicians, diplomats, cabinet secretaries, and journalists found their way to her low, smoke-filled sanctuary like pilgrims approaching an oracle who specialized in devastating prophecies. They leaned forward on her sagging sofas, straining to catch her murmured asides, watching with the ghoulish fascination of spectators at an execution as she unsheathed that lethal wit. A raised eyebrow from Alice could ruin a social season. A well-placed anecdote could derail a political career before dessert was served. On her sofa rested the famous needlepoint pillow that captured her philosophy more honestly than any biography. If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me. It was simultaneously invitation and warning, a declaration that in this house, kindness was suspect, but malice was elevated to art. She collected gossip with the obsessive dedication of a scholar, cataloging the weaknesses, affairs, and hypocrisies of the powerful with the same meticulous care other women devoted to genealogies or recipe collections. Information in her hands was not merely currency, it was a weapon of surgical precision. She mocked presidents with bipartisan cruelty that bordered on genius. Calvin Coolidge, she observed, looked like he was weaned on a pickle, a line so perfectly cruel it became his unofficial epitaph. She dismissed Thomas Dewey, the Republican presidential candidate, as looking like the bridegroom on a wedding cake, a description so devastating it arguably contributed to his electoral defeat. When Franklin Roosevelt, her own cousin and political nemesis, occupied the White House, she called him a second-rate mind but a first-rate temperament, then spent his entire presidency sniping at Eleanor with the fascinated contempt of one complicated woman for another who had chosen a very different way of carrying pain. She leaked secrets to favored journalists with the casual malice of someone who understood that in a town built entirely on perception, the right rumor at the right moment could achieve more than any piece of legislation. She weaponized information with surgical precision, knowing exactly where to insert the blade to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. She outlived 8 administrations, watching presidents parade past like over-dignified actors, auditioning for roles they were not entirely qualified to play, her survival itself becoming a kind of silent indictment of their transience. By the time she reached her 70s and 80s, Alice had become more than a person. She was a force of nature, a living monument to the proposition that wit could be more durable than policy and cruelty more memorable than kindness. She chain-smoked through the decades, her fingers perpetually stained with nicotine, her drawing room hazed with blue smoke that clung to the velvet curtains like incense in a secular cathedral. Visitors found her enthroned in her favorite armchair, a cigarette burning between her fingers, her broad-brimmed hat casting shadows over eyes that had lost none of their predatory intelligence. But for all her dominance in that cramped citadel of cigarette smoke and scathing epigrams, there was one person Alice could not save, could not protect, could not understand: her daughter, Paulina. Paulina Longworth had grown up in the shadow of the most famous woman in America, and the shadow had crushed her with its weight. Where Alice was bold, Paulina was cripplingly shy. Where Alice was forged steel, Paulina was fragile porcelain. Where Alice demanded attention as her birthright, Paulina shrank from it as if it were a physical blow. She had inherited her mother's delicate features, but none of her armor, and she spent her entire life trying to become something her mother might love while knowing, with the terrible intuition of unloved children, that she would always fall short. The tragedy of their relationship lay in Alice's fundamental inability to comprehend weakness. Alice, who had spent her entire life refusing to be vulnerable, who had constructed her entire personality as a fortress against emotional pain, had no idea how to love a child who needed tenderness more than wit. She tried to mold Paulina in her own image, pushing her into society, demanding she be clever, expecting her to navigate the treacherous waters of Washington with the same fearless arrogance Alice possessed. But Paulina had no armor. She was a gentle, anxious soul born into a battlefield, and her mother's attempts to toughen her up served only to inflict wounds that would never heal. Alice would mock Paulina's shyness in front of guests, thinking she was teaching her to laugh at herself. not realizing she was systematically destroying her daughter's already fragile sense of self. She treated Paulina with a mixture of impatience and bewilderment, unable to comprehend why anyone would choose to be weak when they could be formidable. The very qualities that had made Alice famous, her sharp tongue, her defiance, her refusal to be sentimental, became instruments of torture when applied to a child who needed protection rather than preparation. Paulina drifted through her young adulthood like a ghost, searching for stability in a world that felt perpetually unsafe. She married badly to Alexander Sturm, a charming but unstable man who died young, leaving her a widow with a small daughter and a grief she was ill-equipped to manage. She struggled with severe depression and addiction to alcohol and prescription drugs, seeking escape from a pain she could neither articulate nor endure. The cycle of abandonment that had begun with Theodore Roosevelt's inability to look at his newborn daughter in 1884 was completing itself with Alice's inability to see her own child's desperate need for unconditional love. On January 27, 1957, at the age of 31, Paulina died of an overdose in her Chicago apartment. The official cause was listed as acute barbiturate poisoning. The medical examiner ruled it accidental, but everyone who knew the family understood the truth. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life lived under a shadow so dense that sunlight could barely penetrate it. Alice Roosevelt, who had won every battle of her life, had lost the only war that mattered. She had become the abandoning parent she had sworn never to be, not through physical desertion as Theodore had done, but through something subtler and perhaps more devastating, an emotional abandonment, a refusal, or an inability to meet her daughter where she lived, in her fear and need. She had weaponized distance for so long that she no longer knew how to put her weapons down, even for the one person who needed disarmament most. At Paulina's funeral, Alice sat stone-faced and silent, her expression revealing nothing to the small gathering of mourners. She did not cry. She did not speak. She stood in her black dress like a monument to grief that could not be expressed because it was too tangled with guilt, rage, and the terrible recognition that she had failed in the one role that mattered more than political influence or social dominance. She lived another 23 years after Paulina's death, and in those years she never spoke about her daughter. Not once. The name was erased from conversation just as Alice's mother's name had been erased by Theodore Roosevelt 70 years earlier. Friends who dared mention Paulina were met with icy silence, or a change of subject so abrupt it felt like a door slamming. Alice had spent her entire life weaponizing language, but she had no words for this loss. She continued to hold court in her Georgetown sanctuary, presiding over the fading ritual of the Washington Salon like a high priestess of a dying cult. She attended Richard Nixon's inauguration, striking up an unlikely friendship with the disgraced president, because she recognized in him a fellow outsider consumed by resentments and ambition. She watched the Vietnam War unfold on television, offering sardonic commentary on politicians who had learned nothing from the imperial ambitions of her father's generation. She smoked cigarettes and told dirty jokes until the very end, the blue haze of tobacco and the crackling edge of obscenity forming twin veils behind which she hid whatever tenderness might yet have survived inside her. When the Kennedy clan arrived in Washington with their glamour and dynastic ambitions, Alice, by then in her late 70s, observed them with the cool detachment of an anthropologist studying a particularly invasive species. The Kennedys, she remarked, are like the Goths sacking Rome. It was vintage Alice, historically literate, devastatingly apt, and utterly without mercy. She became a living monument, the last tangible link between the gaslit world of the Gilded Age and the fluorescent lit corridors of late 20th century Washington. Presidents came and went, ideologies rose and fell. Through it all, Alice remained in her townhouse, immovable and terrifying, the survivor who had conquered everything except her own loneliness. On February 20, 1980, at the age of 96, Alice Roosevelt died in her sleep. She had outlived her father, her husband, her lovers, her enemies, and her daughter. She had witnessed the transformation of America from a provincial republic to a global superpower, had seen the invention of the automobile, the airplane, the atomic bomb, and the television. She had presided over nearly a century of American history with the detached amusement of someone who understood that power was temporary, but style was eternal. But as the news of her death spread through Washington, marking the end of an era, the question that haunted her final years remained unanswered. Had she ever truly escaped the abandonment that defined her birth, or had she simply learned, through decades of practice and pain, to make abandonment into an art form? She had spent a lifetime proving she did not need anyone, only to find herself, at the end of the century, the last one left in the room. The fortress she had built was impregnable, but it was also empty. And in the silence of that final sleep, the Lioness of Washington was just Alice again, the girl who had climbed onto the roof to be seen, and who had spent the rest of her life hiding in plain sight. Alice Roosevelt spent 96 years proving that she could not be controlled, could not be silenced, could not be forgotten. She turned scandal into power, tragedy into armor, and the White House into her personal stage. In an era when women of her station were expected to be ornamental, she made herself indispensable. When society demanded silence, she insisted on being heard. When the world tried to diminish her, she expanded to fill every available space, commanding attention through sheer force of will and the calculated deployment of her considerable gifts. But legacies are never as simple as the stories we construct around them, especially when they belong to someone who spent her entire existence transforming herself into a story first, a person second. What remains when such a performance finally ends? What endures when the curtain falls on a life lived entirely in the spotlight? In the end, Alice paid the price that all exiles from love must pay. She won her freedom, but she lost everything else. Her daughter died alone in a Chicago apartment, poisoned by barbiturates, and the accumulated weight of never being enough for a mother who had forgotten how to offer unconditional acceptance. Her lovers, Senator Bora and the others whose passionate declarations once seemed to matter, are reduced to footnotes in biographies, their ardor cooled to academic curiosity. Her enemies, the pompous politicians and scandalized society matrons she eviscerated with such surgical precision, are equally forgotten, their reputations destroyed so thoroughly that even the destruction itself has been erased by time. And the world she fought so ferociously to conquer, the glittering capital city she ruled from her Georgetown salon, simply moved on without her. The Washington of gaslight and personal influence, of salons where reputations lived and died on the strength of a well-timed epigram, gave way to the harsh fluorescent reality of modern politics. The intimate cruelties she perfected were replaced by the impersonal brutalities of mass media. Her weapons, wit, charm, the strategic deployment of scandal became obsolete in an age that preferred its entertainment louder and its politics more direct. Because that is the final, brutal irony of Alice Roosevelt's life. She spent every moment refusing to be a victim of her father's neglect, her husband's cruelty, or society's suffocating expectations. She worked tirelessly to ensure that no one would ever again have the power to abandon her, to render her invisible, to treat her as expendable. But in doing so, she became a prisoner of her own defiance. She built a fortress around her heart so impregnable that no one, not even her own daughter, could ever break through. The walls were constructed from wit and cynicism, reinforced with scandal and spectacle, defended by moats of cigarette smoke and caustic observation. Inside that fortress, the wounded child who had been born into a house of death on Valentine's Day, 1884, remained perpetually alone, calling out for attention, because attention was the only form of love she had ever learned to demand or trust. She demanded that attention so fiercely, so relentlessly, that she forgot how to offer tenderness in return, or perhaps she never learned in the first place. Her father had taught her, through his inability to speak her mother's name, that love was something that could be withdrawn without warning. Her stepmother had demonstrated that she would always be the outsider, the reminder of a grief too painful to acknowledge. Her husband had proven that even marriage could be a form of abandonment, that legal intimacy guaranteed nothing. And so Alice learned to be invulnerable, to armor herself so completely that nothing could penetrate her defenses. But in making herself unassailable, she also made herself incapable of the very thing she most desperately needed: genuine human connection. She refused to be abandoned so absolutely that she became the one who did the abandoning, keeping everyone at precisely the distance necessary to prevent them from hurting her, but also preventing them from loving her. We like to imagine that wealth is a fortress, that power is a sanctuary, that fame is a kind of immortality. We comfort ourselves with the fantasy that sufficient accumulation of money, influence, or public adoration can insulate us from the sharp edges of human frailty. But Alice Roosevelt's life stands as a monument to the failure of that illusion. Few women in American history began with more advantages. She was born into one of the nation's most prominent dynasties, raised amidst marble and mahogany, the daughter of a man whose face would be carved into mountains. She dined with emperors, influenced legislation from her drawing room, watched the 20th century unfold from the front row of history. If privilege could confer emotional safety, she would have been the most secure woman alive. Yet beneath all the opulence, the same ancient hungers persisted. The need to be chosen, the terror of being discarded, the ache for love that did not have to be earned through performance or extorted through scandal. These are not vulnerabilities that money can cure or notoriety can heal. They are simply vulnerabilities that wealth is extraordinarily good at disguising, even from those who suffer them. The great bleak truth that emerges from her story is this: even in the most gilded cages, the people inside are as lonely, as hungry, and as breakable as the rest of humanity. The difference lies only in the quality of the furnishings. Some prisons have iron bars and thin blankets. Others feature French wallpaper, presidential portraits, and crystal champagne flutes. But the bars remain. The cold still seeps through. Alice was buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C., a quiet sanctuary of rolling hills and ancient trees where the noise of the Capitol feels miles away. She lies near the famous Adams Memorial, that haunting bronze figure by Augustus St. Gaudens that she had visited often in life, perhaps recognizing in that shrouded, enigmatic woman a kindred spirit who understood the weight of unspoken grief. There was no state funeral, no procession of dignitaries, no grand monument befitting America's longest reigning princess. The dynasty had moved on to other branches, other heirs, other concerns. Her grave is marked by a simple headstone of gray granite, worn smooth by decades of Washington weather, bearing only her name and the years she lived. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, 1884–1980. No angels, no elaborate epitaphs, no sculptural representations of her wit or influence. Just her name and her dates, as if 96 years of fierce, defiant, spectacular existence could be reduced to two numbers separated by a dash. The modesty of that marker is its own form of irony. The woman who spent her entire life demanding to be noticed, who transformed every moment into performance and every conversation into theater, lies beneath stone, so understated it could belong to anyone. For someone who treated oblivion as the only unforgivable fate, the starkness feels almost cruel. But if you visit that grave today, you will notice something that transforms that simplicity into something far more eloquent than any marble monument could be. The ground around her headstone is perpetually scattered with cigarette butts, dozens of them. sometimes hundreds, left by visitors who understand instinctively what Alice Roosevelt truly was. They come from across the country, these pilgrims, drawn by some combination of admiration, recognition, and the complex solidarity that exists between difficult people across time. They stand before her grave, light a cigarette, take a few contemplative drags, and then leave the butt as an offering, a tribute more intimate and authentic than flowers, more honest than prayers. Those cigarette butts speak louder than any inscription could. They say, "We see you. We understand. We recognize in your defiance something of our own struggle against a world that wants to diminish us, control us, make us smaller than we are." They are left by women who have been told to be quiet, to be nice, to make themselves palatable. They are left by people who understand that sometimes survival requires building walls, even when those walls eventually become prisons. The visitors know she was not a princess in a fairy tale, though the newspapers crowned her one. She was not a rebel without a cause, though her behavior scandalized generations. She was not a victim of her circumstances, though she was born into tragedy and raised in emotional exile. She was something far more complex and far more human, a woman who refused to be forgotten. And perhaps, in the end, that was the only victory that ever truly mattered to her. Not happiness, which eluded her despite all her advantages. Not love, which she could neither give nor receive without the protective barrier of performance. Not peace, which would have required a vulnerability she could never risk. But the certainty that she would not disappear, that her existence would leave a mark on the world that could not be erased by time or indifference. The light that went out of Theodore Roosevelt's life on Valentine's Day, 1884, when he lost his wife and turned his face from their newborn daughter, had been rekindled by that daughter's absolute refusal to disappear into the darkness prepared for her. She would not be a footnote in his tragedy. She would not be the unnamed child in the margins of his diary. She would inscribe herself on the century by whatever means necessary, with whatever tools came to hand. She burned bright, consuming the oxygen in every room she entered, scorching the drawing rooms of Washington and illuminating the courts of emperors with her cold blue flame. She burned long, outlasting the eras and the people who tried to define her, watching presidents and ideologies parade past like actors auditioning for roles they were not entirely qualified to play. And yes, she burned alone, the heat of her personality keeping everyone at a safe distance, incinerating the bridges that might have led to genuine intimacy. But she burned. In a world that constantly tried to smother her, to categorize her, to dismiss her as a decorative object or a political nuisance, Alice Roosevelt insisted on being a fire. She transformed herself from the abandoned child of 1884 into a force of nature that could not be contained, controlled, or forgotten. She proved that attention, wielded with sufficient skill and determination, could be converted into a form of immortality. Long after the gas lamps of her youth have flickered out and the smoke of her cigarettes has cleared from the Georgetown air, that fire still glows in the American imagination. It burns in every woman who refuses to be diminished, in every person who chooses defiance over compliance, in everyone who understands that sometimes the most profound act of rebellion is simply refusing to disappear. The ember glowed for 96 years, through world wars and social revolutions, through the transformation of America, from industrial republic to global empire. And when it was finally extinguished on that February morning in 1980, it left behind something more enduring than monuments or memorials, the knowledge that even the most gilded cage cannot contain a spirit determined to burn its own way to freedom. Alice Roosevelt burned bright. She burned long. She burned alone. But she burned.